Imagine this. You're hidden behind a marble pillar inside the Vatican's holiest corridors. The air heavy with incense and something even more intoxicating. The year is 1501 AD, and through the dim glow of wavering candelabras, you glimpse what no one was ever meant to witness inside these sacred chambers. The soft hiss of silk sliding against stone blends with laughter echoing down halls once walked by saints. Your chest thunders as you grasp that you're about to see the most notorious night in papal history. An orgy so vile it would make even ancient Romans redden with shame. The October breeze carries the aroma of roasted chestnuts through the Vatican rooms. Yet this evening, those simple nuts will serve as props in a spectacle that will forever blacken the Catholic Church's name. In Cesare Borgia's private quarters, son of Pope Alexander VI, 50 courtesans ready themselves for a night destined to be recorded in the most hidden diary of Renaissance Rome, guarded in the Vatican archives for centuries like a forbidden confession buried beneath layers of piety. Before uncovering these buried tales of survival and scandal, if history's hidden truths fascinate you, be sure to like this video, subscribe for more, and leave a comment to share where you're listening from. It amazes me that we explore these forgotten accounts together from different corners of the world, linked across time and distance by our shared hunger for the past. The man remembered as the most corrupt pope in history was born Rodrigo de Borgia y Doms on January 1, 1431, in the Spanish town of Zataiva near Valencia. The dust of Iberian roads marked his childhood, but fate would carry him far beyond those modest origins to the marble corridors of papal authority. His uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, had already climbed high in the church ranks, and when Alfonso became Pope Calixtus III in 1455, Rodrigo's future was sealed like wax on a papal decree. At 25, Rodrigo was named cardinal deacon, not by divine calling or true devotion, but through the old practice of nepotism that coursed through the church like poison through a sick man's veins. The ambitious Spaniard reached Rome with burning hunger in his heart and fire in his eyes, eager to seize every chance the eternal city could give him. Rome in the late 15th century stood as a contradiction worthy of Dante's pen. By daylight, pilgrims bowed before golden altars, their whispered prayers drifting upward like smoke. But when night fell, those same streets hosted dealings that left flesh merchants wealthier than they had ever dreamed. The papal court itself had turned into a market, where even salvation bore a price etched in shining ducats. Rodrigo de Borgia grasped this reality more clearly than most. He amassed fortune with the patient craft of a spider weaving its net, gathering church benefices across Europe as if stockpiling gemstones in a chest. Rodrigo lived more like a Renaissance prince than a servant of God. Splendid feasts, grand palaces, and a stream of mistresses who bore him children as regularly as the seasons turned. The most important of these affairs was with Vanna Zacatine, a Roman noblewoman whose beauty was rivaled only by her sharp grasp of papal politics and how to survive its deadly currents. Between 1474 and 1482, she gave Rodrigo 4 children who would later stand at the heart of the dark saga to come: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Each of them became a piece in their father's political chessboard, their destinies traded away to feed his relentless ambition. Even during his years as cardinal, Rodrigo's conduct shocked the city of Rome, a difficult thing in a place where scandal was daily bread. In 1460, Pope Pius II wrote him a bitter letter, condemning his behavior in Siena that had scandalized both town and court. But shame was not something Rodrigo allowed himself. He sought the papacy, and moral scruples were hurdles to step over, not ideals to follow. The conclave of August 1492 unfolded like a dance of corruption set to music. Inside the Sistine Chapel, beneath the ceiling Michelangelo would later paint, 23 cardinals gathered to select the next vicar of Christ. Gold was passed as easily as water, pledges were whispered like prayers, and benefices handed out as though they were holy bread. When the smoke rose on August 11, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia stood revealed as Pope Alexander VI, a triumph won through what even contemporaries admitted was simony, the buying and selling of sacred office. Strangely enough, Rome rejoiced. Its people had grown used to their Spanish cardinal and looked forward to a reign of splendor and vitality. Fires blazed across the 7 hills, torchlight parades wound through the old streets, and victory arches appeared like prayers carved into wood and stone. His coronation at St. Peter's Basilica on August 26 drew what many described as the loudest ovation ever given to a pontiff. Alexander VI began his rule with moves that hinted at reform. He restored order to Rome's streets, where more than 200 murders had taken place in the months before his election. He created districts with magistrates charged with keeping peace, and every Tuesday he personally heard complaints, delivering judgments with an efficiency that witnesses praised. For a short while, it looked as if Providence had set the right man upon St. Peter's throne. But power, like strong wine, unmasks a man's true nature rather than changing it. Alexander's first reforms were soon eclipsed by his constant effort to raise the fortunes of his children, most notably his sons Juan and Cesare. Juan received the title of Duke of Gandia in Spain and was married to a cousin of the Spanish sovereign. Cesare, though still only 18, was placed in the high office of Archbishop of Valencia, and not long after was advanced to the dignity of cardinal, appointments he regarded as mere steps upward rather than sacred responsibilities. The papal residence under Alexander's hand turned into a hall where holiness and vice moved together in a grotesque performance. Banquets lasted until the late hours, joined by amusements that exceeded the limits of what was considered proper, even in the age of the Renaissance. Julia Farnese, Alexander's mistress, renowned in Rome as Julia la Bella for her striking beauty, walked through the Vatican as openly as a prince of the Church, her figure a constant sign that spiritual vows had been discarded for worldly passion. Into this world of glaring contrasts came Johann Burchard, a precise witness equipped with a pen and a memory that spared no detail. Born around 1450 in Niederhaslach in Alsace, this German cleric studied canon law and climbed the ecclesiastical ranks until he became papal master of ceremonies, a post that brought him directly into the innermost workings of papal life. From 1483 onward, beginning under Pope Sixtus IV, Burchard kept what he called his Liber Not Eram, a careful diary that described both the splendid rituals and the disgraceful conduct of 5 successive pontiffs. Burchard was no dreamer. His mind was that of a record keeper and his eyes those of a clerk. His pages lacked the color of other writers, yet the very plainness of his voice gave them force. He noted papal rituals with the same detail he gave to papal misconduct, leaving a written record so exact that later archivists of the Vatican read it with unease. The master of ceremonies stood in a singular station. He was too senior to be pushed aside, but too minor to share in corruption, drifting like the faint shadow of a flame across the Vatican's private chambers, seeing everything though seeming almost unseen. Cardinals turned to him for guidance in ritual matters and ignored his presence when they should have guarded their tongues. This ability to vanish in plain sight became his greatest weapon as the chronicler of papal sins. By the 1490s, the reputation of the Borgia household had already begun to attract sharp criticism throughout Europe. Juan, Alexander's firstborn, had taken the title of Duke of Gandia, but his nature was as corrupt as his promotion was unearned. Tales spread about his cruelty, his unchecked appetites, and his failures in command. The supposed jewel of the Borgia dynasty was turning into a burden that even his father could not dismiss. The events of June 14, 1497 altered everything. The body of Juan was found drifting in the waters of the Tiber, his throat slit and 9 wounds marking his flesh. The killing shocked all of Rome and struck Alexander with such despair that many whispered divine punishment had finally come upon the Borgias. For 3 days and nights the Pope shut himself away, refusing food or rest, weeping as a broken man rather than the supreme pontiff who once cowed kings. In his sorrow, Alexander declared a program of reform for the Church. He urged restrictions on the splendor of the papal household, a reorganization of the apostolic chancery, and a ban on simony and concubinage. For a brief while, it appeared that private loss might accomplish what years of condemnation could not. A commission of cardinals and canon lawyers began drafting decrees that foreshadowed the reforms of the Council of Trent, though that council was still decades away. Yet mourning, like all else in Alexander's nature, soon passed. Within a few months, the reform plans were shelved, stored away like youthful love letters too awkward to recall. The Pope's attention shifted back to his surviving offspring, especially Cesare, whose relentless drive and merciless will would now direct the family's destiny. If Juan had been Alexander's heart, then Cesare was his sword, keen, cold, and entirely without pity. Cesare Borgia possessed a magnetism that captivated both allies and enemies. Tall, striking, and gifted with a mind verging on brilliance, he had once been steered toward the church as his father had been, but his gifts lay not in theology but in battle and politics. In 1498 he renounced his cardinalate, becoming the first in history to abandon that office, and turned openly toward secular ambition. The political stage of Italy offered Cesare openings that might have strained even Machiavelli's fancy. King Louis XII of France sought papal approval for his annulment, while many Italian duchies stood vulnerable to conquest by one bold enough. Alexander saw in these affairs the chance to carve out a realm for his son, even at the cost of welcoming foreign armies against fellow Italians. Through sieges, secret killings, and masterful intrigue, Cesare secured lands in central Italy, making himself one of Europe's most formidable figures. His ruthless effectiveness so impressed Niccolò Machiavelli that he later took Cesare as the very model for his prince, admiring the blend of cruelty and efficiency in the chase for power. But victories of this scale demanded resources greater than papal income alone, driving Alexander toward ever more inventive means of raising funds. In those later years, indulgences, church offices, and even cardinals' hats were openly sold. Wealthy families could buy positions for their sons, purchasing spiritual security along with prestige. The College of Cardinals grew not by merit but by money, as Alexander named 47 new cardinals during his reign, each one bringing thousands of ducats into the papal treasury and ultimately into Cesare's arsenal. Rome at this time looked like a city ruled as if it were conquered by its own masters. The Borgias handled the papal states as their private realm, with Alexander as the father and Cesare acting like the heir to a throne. Lucrezia, though her image would later be softened, was reduced to a tool in marriage pacts designed to serve the family's ambitions rather than her own desires. Her first union with Giovanni Sforza was dissolved on claims of impotence once the politics shifted, and soon she was given in marriage to Alfonso of Biseglia, who was later slain, very likely on Cesare's orders, when that alliance stopped serving Borgia needs. The Vatican chambers in those years became the backdrop for ever more elaborate spectacles that pushed the limits of propriety, even for Renaissance Rome. Alexander delighted in plays, concerts, and banquets that went on until the early hours. The guest list included cardinals, envoys, rich traders, and many courtesans whose charms were measured as much by discretion as by indiscretion. These evenings were not merely diversions. They functioned as shows of papal splendor, occasions for bargaining, and subtle tests of loyalty among those who claimed to be Alexander's allies. Cardinals who joined the Pope's festivities tied themselves to his excesses, leaving them hesitant to criticize or betray him. Those who declined the invitations risked being branded as enemies, facing reprisals like so many of the Borgia adversaries before them. By the autumn of 1501, the family had reached the very peak of both influence and corruption. Cesare had just completed the conquest of Romagna, winning admiration from military men across Europe. Alexander had survived challenges including Charles VIII's invasion and constant struggles with feuding noble houses. The Jubilee of 1500 had drawn throngs of pilgrims to Rome, swelling the papal treasury and the city's brothels in equal measure. It was against this backdrop of victory and vice that Cesare imagined what would later be remembered as the Banquet of Chestnuts. His precise reason for staging it remains debated. Was it meant as a celebration, a piece of political theater, or simply the end result of years of escalating indulgence? Writers of the time give different motives, yet they all agree on the shocking details that stunned even the most hardened witnesses of papal corruption. October 31st, 1501. All Hallows' Eve, when the line between holy and unholy was thought to be at its thinnest. Perhaps the date was chosen intentionally, or perhaps it was chance that the most notorious papal revel ever took place on the very night when spirits were believed to roam among men. Whatever the reason, the symbolism could not have been more fitting. On a night devoted to honoring the dead, the Borgia household prepared to commit deeds that would bury whatever dignity the papacy still possessed. Cesare's chambers in the Vatican, part of the papal palace, had been richly adorned by Pinturicchio during the first years of Alexander's rule. The painted walls showed scenes from ancient myths and Christian legends, forming a backdrop full of irony for actions that belonged to neither world. These halls, intended to display the riches and cultured taste of the Borgia Pope, instead became the stage for an evening that summed up all the accusations long made against his family. The list of those invited revealed the depth of their corruption. Cardinals, who by right should have been at prayer, mingled with Roman nobles whose fortunes had secured their silence about past scandals of the papacy. Diplomatic envoys from across Europe also attended, some no doubt treating the occasion as a chance to learn more of papal plans, others simply curious to see how far the Borgias would stretch the limits of decency. Yet the true focus of the night were the 50 courtesans Cesare gathered for his guests' amusement. These were not poor street women, but refined courtesans skilled in the subtle craft of pleasure and in guarding the secrets demanded by powerful men. Many of them had already appeared at papal festivities. They knew the unspoken rules and the rewards awaiting those who satisfied their notable patrons. Johann Burchard, serving as master of ceremonies, was present not as a participant but as a recorder. His role required him to remain on hand for any official duties, even in the course of private gatherings. This responsibility placed him in the ideal position to observe and to set down details others might prefer erased. His account, written in Latin with the cold precision of a physician's report, preserves not only the incidents of that night but the wider moral decay of Alexander's papacy. According to Burchard's careful notes, the evening opened in ordinary fashion, with a banquet held in Cesare's own chambers. The dishes reflected the season and the rank of the company, paired with wines from papal cellars aged in the stone vaults of Rome. Talk flowed as freely as the wine, turning to politics, campaigns of war, and patronage of the arts, subjects that allowed the assembly to display its refinement and culture. But once the dishes were removed, the tone of the night shifted as the true entertainment began. The 50 courtesans, clad in silks and velvets chosen to flatter their beauty, began to dance before the guests. Musicians, bound to secrecy about what they saw, played rhythms that urged the dancers into movements of growing intimacy. What came next tested even the wide limits of behavior tolerated during Alexander's reign. As Burchard carefully noted, the courtesans began the dances still clothed, but as the hours passed and wine flowed more freely, garments were slowly cast aside until the performers were entirely nude. This steady shift from ordinary diversion to blatant display happened gradually enough that no guest could claim surprise, yet clearly enough that none could doubt the night's final purpose. The central feature that gave the banquet its name involved the chestnuts. Servants took the candelabras from the tables and set them on the floor, forming small circles of flickering light broken by patches of darkness. Chestnuts were then scattered across the floor, and the naked courtesans were ordered to crawl on hands and knees to gather them, their figures lit by the candles as they moved through this strange obstacle course. According to Burchard's chronicle, Pope Alexander VI observed the spectacle from a seat of distinction. At his side were Cesare and Lucrezia, and the presence of the Pope's daughter at such an affair has long baffled historians. Was she complicit in the family's corruption, or trapped in circumstances beyond her will? Sources of the period disagree, but all concur that she remained there as the night reached its lowest depths. The final stage turned into contests among the male guests, competing over who could lie with the greatest number of courtesans. The winners were promised rewards: tunics of silk, shoes, caps, and other costly goods, luxuries at a time when such items were handmade. Servants kept record of each man's conquests in public view, turning acts of intimacy into a spectacle staged for papal pleasure. Burchard's report of these scenes was kept in the Vatican's secret archive, sealed away from public knowledge for centuries. When Pope Leo XIII permitted scholars entry to the archives in the late 1800s, he openly admitted his reluctance to expose materials that might tarnish Alexander VI's memory. That such concern remained necessary more than 400 years later shows the lasting power of the scandal Burchard so precisely described. The morning after the Banquet of Chestnuts, Rome looked outwardly unchanged, yet its spiritual ground had shifted. Pilgrims still crowded into St. Peter's for Mass, the cardinals continued their assemblies, and Alexander himself appeared in public as though nothing unusual had occurred. But word of the orgy spread quickly among the city's servants, guards, and lesser officials who had seen or heard what had taken place. Reports of the night soon traveled outside Rome through diplomatic letters of foreign envoys, some present at the feast and others relying on trustworthy witnesses. Documents preserved in European archives capture the shock and revulsion of observers who had thought no papal act could still astonish them. Even the ambassadors of rulers with courts far from pure expressed amazement at what had occurred within the Vatican's sacred walls. The political weight of the scandal reached well beyond questions of private conduct. Reformers across Europe, including Girolamo Savonarola in Florence, seized upon the accounts as proof that the papacy itself had fallen into hopeless corruption. Demands for a general council to depose Alexander VI grew louder, fueled by vivid descriptions of conduct that seemed to embody the harshest charges ever made against the Borgia pontiff. Alexander's reaction to reproach was predictably defiant. Instead of showing regret or introducing reforms, he doubled down on support for Cesare's conquests and carried on with the same extravagant lifestyle that marked his papacy from the beginning. If anything, the scandal appeared to release him from the last restraints, as though public recognition of his corruption excused him from pretending even a surface level of respectability. The Banquet of Chestnuts came near the close of Alexander's rule, yet it was not a single lapse in morality. Rather, it stood as the natural outcome of years of steadily growing vice that had reshaped the papal court into something earlier generations of Christians would not have recognized. The sacred and the profane had become so entangled that telling them apart demanded an effort few cared to attempt. Cesare Borgia's career advanced rapidly in the wake of the scandal, proving that outrage had little effect on political decisions in Renaissance Italy. His victories continued to win respect from observers who valued results more than the personal morality of those who achieved them. Machiavelli's later reflections on Cesare's strategies drew a sharp line between political effectiveness and virtue, insisting that a ruler must use whatever means are required for success. Yet triumph gained on such terms was fragile. Alexander VI passed away on August 18, 1503, likely from malaria, though whispers of poison reflected the climate of fear and intrigue that had defined his reign. His death immediately altered the fate of his children. Cesare's influence collapsed without papal support, and he perished as a soldier for hire in Spain just 4 years after. Lucrezia lived on as Duchess of Ferrara, though the scandals of her youth and the infamous shadow of her family followed her until her death. The succeeding pope, Julius II, refused to inhabit the Borgia rooms where the banquet had taken place. He moved upstairs and engaged Raphael to adorn his new apartments with frescoes that became some of the most admired works in the Vatican. This literal change of chambers symbolized a larger attempt to separate the papacy from Alexander's moral failures, though restoring papal honor proved far harder than refurbishing painted walls. Judgments of the Banquet of Chestnuts have shifted with the moral and political winds of later centuries. Catholic writers of the 19th and early 20th centuries often questioned the truth of Burchard's chronicle, suggesting either that no reliable witness could have described such behavior or that later edits had altered the record. Protestant historians, by contrast, embraced the tale as confirmation of their critique of papal authority and Catholic moral claims. Modern scholarship tends to accept Burchard's account as fundamentally reliable, while situating it in the larger setting of Renaissance Italy. They point out that sexual exhibitions and public shows with courtesans were common among secular princes of the era. What made Alexander's conduct scandalous was his role as head of the Catholic Church, not the novelty of the acts themselves. The very architectural setting of the banquet adds still another layer of historical irony to that October night. The chambers where the infamous orgy unfolded had been decorated by Pinturicchio with frescoes illustrating stories from classical mythology as well as Christian tradition. Painted gods and saints gazed down from the walls, while scenes played out beneath them that would have shocked both pagans and Christians, offering a grim commentary on the gulf between lofty artistic ideals and raw human conduct. Later archaeological studies of the Vatican apartments uncovered structural details that clarify how such episodes could actually occur within the papal palace. The Borgia suites were arranged with many rooms joined by corridors, allowing space for grand ceremonies as well as secret entertainments. The walls provided enough insulation that noise in one chamber did not carry easily to another, giving the privacy Alexander required for ever more extreme indulgences. The careful preservation of Burchard's journal in the Vatican's secret archive raises unresolved questions about how the Church has dealt with its own past. For centuries these papers stayed sealed, open only to a small number of scholars who received direct approval from papal authority. Choosing to preserve such material while keeping it hidden suggests both an awareness of its importance and a deep embarrassment over its revelations. Accounts from contemporaries beyond Burchard's testimony add support to at least some version of the episodes described. Diplomatic letters from that era mention papal revels that stretched propriety, even if few sources provide the explicit detail that makes Burchard's narrative so vivid. The fact that several independent witnesses point toward the same conclusion strengthens belief in the essential truth of the Banquet of Chestnuts. The effect of the scandal on later papal history cannot be measured only by immediate politics. Alexander VI's conduct, culminating in events like the banquet, armed Protestant reformers who insisted the papacy was beyond redemption. Martin Luther's fierce denunciations of papal power gained added force from concrete examples of moral collapse at the top of the Church. The Catholic Counter-Reformation that began in the mid-1500s arose in part as a direct response to scandals of this sort. Church officials came to see that moral reform was essential to regain papal credibility and blunt Protestant attack. The Council of Trent's decrees on clerical discipline and creation of seminaries for priests directly addressed abuses that Alexander VI had so brazenly displayed. But the reforms carried costs that went deeper than official decrees. The splendor of Baroque papal ritual after Trent reflected an effort to restore dignity through majestic imagery and tightly managed ceremony. The casual revels that marked Alexander's court were replaced with staged presentations designed to project papal greatness and limit chances for disgrace. Yet the psychological effect of spectacles like the Banquet of Chestnuts, on those who joined, and on those who merely heard, remains impossible to measure fully from the distance of history. For the courtesans who took part that night, the experience was likely seen as professional duty rather than personal dishonor. Their place in society made such service an economic necessity instead of a matter of moral preference. For the church dignitaries who were present, the occasion may have meant either conscious participation in corruption or reluctant obedience to papal expectations that carried the risk of career punishment. The reaction of the broader Roman population to reports of papal conduct shows the complex relationship between spiritual authority and popular devotion. Even though Alexander's moral failings were widely known, pilgrims still journeyed to Rome, masses were still celebrated, and the sacramental system continued to operate. This indicates that ordinary Catholic belief had grown with enough theological depth to separate the personal morality of church officials from the legitimacy of their religious functions. The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than an isolated case of papal immorality. It highlights the larger shift of Renaissance Italy from medieval Christendom into an early modern European order. Alexander VI's actions echoed the values of secular princes who relied on display and extravagance to prove their strength. But his role as the supreme leader of Catholic Christianity created contradictions that ultimately could not endure. The night of October 31, 1501, therefore stands as a defining point in papal history, the moment when the clash between spiritual authority and temporal ambition reached a crisis that demanded resolution. The scandal forced later popes to choose between earthly splendor and moral credibility, a decision that influenced the Catholic Church for centuries. Looking back across more than 500 years at that candlelit night in the Vatican chambers, we can see reflections of mankind's endless struggle between sacred ideals and worldly desires. The chestnuts scattered across the marble floors of papal apartments were simple fruits that became emblems of how far human dignity can collapse once power is free of moral restraint. In a world where such contradictions remain, where religious leaders sometimes fail their flocks, where ambition corrupts even those called to higher service, the Banquet of Chestnuts endures both as historical disgrace and lasting warning. The candles that glowed in that notorious night have long since gone dark. The participants turned to dust in Roman soil, and the very halls where these scenes occurred now hold priceless artworks shown to reverent visitors. Yet Burchard's precise Latin notes preserve those moments when the line between sacred and profane was completely erased, when the Vicar of Christ seemed no different from the most debased emperor of Rome, and when chestnuts scattered on marble floors bore witness to the gap between human desire and divine calling. In the end, perhaps this is the deeper meaning of Alexander VI's forbidden revel, not only proof of one man's weakness, but also a mirror of humanity's capacity for both elevation and corruption. The same race that raised soaring cathedrals and produced sublime sacred art also gathered in papal halls to watch performances that undermined the foundations of spiritual authority. Before dawn, the chestnuts lying on those Vatican floors were gathered away.